Hey everybody. So quick follow-up video to the video I posted last night about the Godfather and Vito Corleone's master class in displaying FE on several different levels. Feel free to watch that if you haven't yet. And then that generated a comment from friend of the show, Isaac Lemon, I think it is. And he asked this. There seems to be a consensus that Michael Corleone is an INTJ. Do you think that his FE blindness is a strong factor in how things go downhill through the trilogy? So I thought this was an interesting question that I feel like riffing off of because I love talking about stuff like this when it comes to personality types in movies and fiction and stuff like that. Warning, I'm going to be giving a lot of spoilers probably for the Godfather movies. So if you haven't seen the Godfather movies by now and you don't want to be spoiled, you probably want to wait until you see the movies before you watch this video because I'm going to spoil a lot of it. Okay, so that being said, I think I think this comment is definitely on to something, and to me, I think there's a classic story arc of what I call the TE tragedy, um, and in a nutshell, it's basically if you look at it in classic Jungian personality type or psychological type terms, where people are just extroverted thinkers, or they're extroverted feelers, or they're extroverted sensors, or introverted intuitives, and that's really about it. It doesn't, he didn't really go through each function having its particular role in different types. It was basically, are you an extroverted thinker, an introverted thinker, that kind of thing. Whatever your lead function was, and he gets a little into the auxiliary second function, but really he focuses on the lead. And he had this whole sort of take on, because keep in mind he's trying to use psychological types to sort of explain phenomena in the psychoanalytic community. So if somebody's displaying a particular type of complex or neuroses, um, he would often tie it to what their psychological type was. And so somebody who's an extroverted thinker is focusing so much on the extroverted thinking that they're losing track of, the introverted feeling, this sort of opposite judging function, right? And because of that, they have all these sort of unconscious, you know, things going on, sort of pulling the strings behind the scenes, and causing all kinds of havoc, right? In their mind or in their psyche. And the classic story, is the lead extroverted thinker who is so focused on building his empire that he loses track of what's important to him, right? And so sort of loses his family and his friends and all of that along the way because he's so focused on building his empire. And there's plenty of stories throughout history that sort of use that as a motif or a theme, and I think effectively that's what the Godfather is, right? When you look at it as Michael Corleone's story, not Vito Corleone's story, but Michael Corleone's story. Vito's got his own story, and so it's the tragic downfall of what I would say call the extroverted thinker, and and anytime you talk about characters or in movies or in books, and you try to sync like a psychological type to them, there's always going to be holes, right? Because the writers often aren't thinking about this kind of stuff. It's just sort of kind of a common law of the universe that just sort of manifests itself, whether or not they know it or not. and they have to do things, with the plot and whatnot that, people are going to be sort of acting, quote unquote, out of character. You might have a strong TE type, um, who is displaying a bunch of FI or FE or something in one scene or another. And so, so I'll fully admit that, if to the extent I try to say so and so is a particular type, yes, there's probably going to be some, evidence in the movie of them acting a different type of way. And I get it. I get all that. And hopefully you guys do too. But I think by and large, looking at broad strokes, looking at sort of high level view, Michael Corleone is the lead extroverted thinker that is, has his tragic downfall because he loses track of the FI stuff. Okay. Loses track of, his family, his wife, those that are close to him, and and maybe for good reason, right? I mean, sometimes they just outright betray him, like Fredo does, but he's got to go with his TE over his FI when sort of figuring out how to deal with that, right? And now that being said, the whole point of authors usually aren't thinking about this stuff. We do know that, like, back in the day, George Lucas and Coppola and Spielberg and all those like big directors back in the 70s, they knew this Jungian stuff. They were very in tune with the Joseph Campbell Hero with a Thousand Faces story arc. And so to some extent, I do think that Coppola and maybe Mario Puzo, who wrote the novel, is taking this sort of Jungian psychological type into account when coming up with their characters. So let me step back. So is Michael an INTJ? Maybe. Clearly an extroverted thinker, because he's all about plotting and everything. But when I think of the INTJs, or even maybe the INFJs, whoever the lead intuitive is, usually those are the knowers, and that's the Tom Hagen, right? The Robert Duvall character. If you want to find who the lead intuitive is, or maybe even the lead introverted sensor, SI type, try to find the person that everybody goes to for knowledge, the person that's got some sort of knowledge about the way things work or the way things are, what's going on behind the scenes, or maybe some ancient wisdom. And the main characters, the people that are sort of doing the extroverted thinking or the extroverted feeling and driving the story along, the introverted intuitives are the people that those main characters go to when they need knowledge. Think of Yoda, right? Or to some extent Obi-Wan Kenobi, Merlin, your classic wizards that have some sort of tie-in to knowledge that other people don't have, because the knowing types, the introverted intuitives, intuition, NI types and the SI types, we're the knowers. We're, if you think of all of the psychological types sort of making up the overall cultural ecosystem, the knowers are the ones with the information. And and they pop up all the time. I mean, there's all kinds of classic characters. Another one that I just saw recently, if you watch Wheel of Time, it's the ogre giant looking weird purple looking guy, but he's like the librarian guy, or like the guy who works at the bookstore or the library and has all this like knowledge about the way things are or used to be. And I would say the lead intuitives tend to be the character where they have sort of knowledge about ancient wisdom, like, knowledge of how things have always been, in the culture or whatnot. Where the SI types are probably going to be more of like the knowledge of the here and now, like what's going on right now. So Tom Hagen is probably even more of an ISTJ, because he's not taking Michael Corleone or Vito Corleone aside and saying, hey, you know, this is the wisdom of the elders, and here's how things, have always been throughout time. He's more about information right now, like who's doing what, and he's kind of like their little spy. And so he's the information guy. I'm just kind of thinking of other examples out there, like the guy in Game of Thrones, the spider guy, that had all the knowledge of what was going on in the kingdom and had his little spies everywhere. Again, a knowing type, somebody that people would go to get information. So Michael Corleone isn't that, right? He's more of a main character type, right? He's more of an actor. His story is about doing things, not just about knowing things. The knowers are kind of the side characters, right? And I can see why everybody sort of taps him as an INTJ, because he is, introverted in the classic sense. And, we tend to think of INTJs as the quote unquote masterminds, and he's sort of the biggest mastermind in movie history to some extent. But I would say that's more TE stuff, right? That's more showing that he's an extroverted thinker. And so in the classic Jungian sense, where you just are sort of looking at their dominant function, he's an extroverted thinker that sort of gives up his kingdom for introverted, or his introverted feeling is sort of his downfall, right? Where you contrast him to Vito Corleone, who's the extroverted feeler, was about, maintaining social relations, the social hierarchy, the social institutions, where Michael just goes full Leroy Jenkins, right? At the end of the first Godfather, and takes out, the heads of the five, or the other families, right? The classic, ENTJ kind of move, going full Leroy Jenkins. Now, in the short run, it sort of worked out for him. You could argue in the long run, it probably didn't. But so it wasn't like a complete downfall that you usually see, but it was him just sort of, going against the grain and doing it the way he wanted to do it, right? And not listening to what his advisors or anybody else would tell him to do. Okay, so can you look at this as being, as him having sort of FE blindness? Is he an INTJ? I don't know if FE is necessarily his polar function, because again, I think he's more ENTJ, ESTJ, lead thinker. So then that would make his polar function more of an SI, thing. And that's kind of hard to argue, I think. I mean, in some respects, Michael Corleone's a sort of a Mary Sue character where he's good at everything. It's sort of hard to argue that, or find examples of him not paying attention to the SI stuff, other than, I guess, taking out the five families. Like, Vito would have never done that, right? Or any of his sort of surrounding advisors, probably wouldn't have done that, because it was sort of going against all of tradition. So I guess in some respects that's kind of showing SI polar. But again, I think they weren't really looking at it through this sort of, the people writing the story and making the movie. I don't think we're looking through it through the lens that we look through things, polar functions and all that. I think it's more of the classic Jungian dichotomy of your lead function versus your inferior function, or whatever the, if you're a lead judger, whatever the other opposite judging function would be. So if you're a lead feeler, introverted feeler, you're ignoring the extroverted thinking, that kind of thing. Okay. But I guess if we wanted to tag him as an INTJ, he does show sort of, again, this sort of effy blindness in the sense that he's sort of going against tradition, and going against kind of what his father had sort of established as the status quo, and starts getting into the drugs and all that kind of stuff that his father clearly wanted to stay out of. So yeah, I mean, that is one way of looking at it. That is one way of analyzing it. um but again, I don't think that when they crafted the movie to the extent they were thinking of this Jungian psychological type stuff, I think again it was more extroverted thinking versus introverted feeling. And the introverted feeling was sort of his downfall, right? Slamming the door in Kate's face at the end of the at the end of the first movie, or not really slamming it, and but like clearly, there was this motif of closing out Kay, so that he could focus on his empire and whatever was going on in his office. And the very last scene is this door closing on Kay, where he's just shutting her out. And to me, that's an example of shutting out the FI part, not necessarily the FE part. Um, so, anyways, but I think with like with all of this stuff, you can make a case for anything. So I'd be interested in hearing, if anybody has a different take on it. But I think that is sort of the classic tragedy motif or formula, is to find the kind of the Breaking Bad, Ozymandias, Julius Caesar. What are some of the other big tragedies with King Lear? Maybe, I don't know. Maybe was King Lear an extrovert thinker? I'd have to think through that. Citizen Kane, with whoever the not the Orson Welles character, but like the guy that he's researching, or is it the Orson Welles character? Maybe it is. Anyways, yeah, that is the Orson Welles character. But you know what I'm saying. So the guy, the King Richard, my kingdom for a horse kind of guy, where they just sort of get ahead of their skis, and everything comes crashing down because they lose sight of that FI stuff, the family, the friends, and then ultimately the family or the friends betray them because they weren't paying attention enough to them or whatever, doing that FI stuff. Okay, I think that's about it. Interested to hear your thoughts. I just wanted to do a quick response because I thought it was a cool comment. And I love getting into stuff like this. So feel free to comment more if you're interested. All right, bye.